I'm going to get started. So first person is going to be, it's going to be Skip, and then George, and then Brian. Skip, what do you think about persona? Anything you want to say?
Okay, the first thing I would say is that everybody needs to see the movie, The Thomas Crown Affair, the first one, the one with Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway. And sort of late in the movie, we've been introduced to the fact that Thomas Crown has everything, and he's wealthier than wealthy, but he seems very pensive and worried, and so Faye asks him, what do you have to worry about? You know, you have everything. What do you have to worry about? And he says, what I want to be tomorrow. And so, you know, the question arises then, who are you, and how do you present yourself? And so in terms of a persona, I am, for the purposes of this meeting, presenting myself as somebody that knows something about Carl Jung. I have his home in Bollingen behind me in my virtual background here. And, but, you know, the reality is I've never had any training in Carl Jung. I've read his books. I've been to a couple of meetings of the Jung societies around Washington area, the Jung Society of Washington, and so on. But mainly I've had experiences, and Carl Jung's teachings resonated with me with respect to my own experiences. And so I've presented myself as many things. I've presented myself as a Marine Corps officer, as a student in business school who knew something about statistics once, as an attorney, and I've managed to figure out a lot of things I don't like to do. What I did like to do was build a company in Japan, which I did back in the early 80s through 1985, and I spent 8 years of my life there. So after fashion, I'm sort of a Japan expert. But more recently, I built a company mainly involving India and Saudi Arabia, believe it or not, which ultimately had 6,000 employees in India and 40 production centers there. And so what is that persona? It's the persona of an executive. And who are you when you get up in front of a group of people that are making $100 a month for their work, and you know, try to be a leader to those people? It's a big question. So that's one side of it, but I want to draw everyone's attention to the work of the Korean pop group BTS, which has adopted Murray Stein, one of the leading Jungian analysts in the world, his book, Map of the Soul, Jung's Map of the Soul, it's called, for a major piece of their work. And they've been pointing back toward Jungian psychology for several years now, even going before they actually explicitly did it. But they have a recent map called album called Map of the Soul Persona. And if you watch their music video Persona, you'll get a pretty good idea what a persona is. They did a super job of depicting a persona. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay, George, you're next.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. I just want to echo what Skip said regarding Murray Stein, particularly that book. I think that's a wonderful place to start if anyone's looking for a proper indoctrination to analytical psychology. I think Stein's book, particularly Map of the Soul, is a good one. What's persona? I guess I'll also start by mentioning that for me, a good film that illustrates this is Fight Club. You guys familiar with that? I forgot the name of the two actors, American actor, Brad Pitt, and I forgot the other gentleman, but the Fight Club. I think it illustrates this grappling between ego and persona.
Yes.
Thank you for agreeing. Oh, by the way, thank you, Shrink Cat, for having me again, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Persona it's one of the funny structures of the psyche. It's the only structure that comes from without. All the other structures of the psyche emerge from within. And the persona heralds the ego's relationship, and it facilitates the ego's relationship with the external world, just as the animus facilitates their relationship with the transpersonal realm. Jung says that the persona is the false self, yet there's a utility there. Again, as I mentioned, it facilitates egoic interactions with the external world. If you're going to localize persona, it lies between ego and collective consciousness, and we seldom have one persona. Jung uses personae as the plural, and we go back and forth. I think one of the risks we take is, at least existentially, is to conflate a persona or personae with ego. And that becomes problematic, particularly if you practice some form of like interfaith, to use that term, regarding the marriage between East and West. It gets problematic. Jung employs the term persona in a particular manner. It's the center of consciousness. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Let's see. My mistake. I was conflating persona with ego, ironically. Let's get back to persona. Jung also talks about that there's a compromise with the persona. In order to have some sort of relationship, again, it's the relating function for the external. One needs to kind of suspend one's individuality when one is identified through the persona. And I forgot to mention, I should have mentioned earlier on with the Murray Stein book, Jung, again, he doesn't talk much about the persona. It's interesting, but he does introduce it in Psychological Types, and later on in his essay, The Relationship Between Ego and the Collective Unconscious, just in case if anyone is interested. But he mentions it, but he doesn't really place a lot of emphasis on persona. So today, I was just telling Shrink Cat that for tonight, I was reviewing this text. And it's one of my favorite. Oh, there you go. Yeah, thank you, Brian. So if anyone is interested, by the way, in the introduction, John Beebe is mentioned. John Beebe has influenced so many, so I encourage everyone to come Sunday. Your question, how does the persona serve to impress others while concealing yourself? I've been scratching my head on that question. Also the third one, and I just realized before this interview, I think the question is flawed. Because particularly with with concealing, I don't think the persona has that type of authority, that type of psychic authority. The concealing, I think, agent here is the ego. Ego is the authority, is the one that does the concealing. So I'm not sure how to respond to that question. How does the persona serve to impress others while concealing yourself? What I also thought simultaneously with regards to trying to respond to this question, I think I need to give it further thought. And I think a lot has to do with that the question is flawed. I'm not sure how to respond to that. Also, I think the third question is also flawed. It says, how does true individuality emerge from under the persona? Okay. I mean, individuality for me is it's an attempt to describe egoic characteristics. When it comes to the persona, the attributes, the characteristics really nourish or scaffold what Jung calls individualism. So how does true individuality emerge from under the persona? I think when personas are somehow suspended, when they become like eroded, and there's an emergence of ego material, what Jung calls a progression of libido, and there's a regression of libido with regards to persona, then I think you might be able to answer that question. But I find the second and third question problematic, because I think there's a flaw there's a semantic flaw, you know. So I'm not going to be able to respond to them completely, okay, unless I'm allowed to talk about ego.
Oh, please.
You know?
I mean, you can...
So I'll stop there.
Sure. Okay, so Brian is going to be next. I just want to remind everybody that we record all our meetups, and we make the recording available afterwards on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. I'll send a link in the chat. So feel free to keep your video on or off, whatever you prefer. Okay, Brian, you're next.
Thank you for coming, and thanks to my fellow panelists and everyone who's here. It's great to be with you all tonight. And as I was reading, I think I'm on the same wavelength with George. I was reading this book, Persona, which is definitely a very interesting one. I definitely commend that one forward. And then also, like George had said, reading through Jung's thoughts in psychological types and 2 essays on analytical psychology, specifically the relationships between the ego and the unconscious. It struck me, it was really nice to go back and read some of that material because I think in the wider Jungian community, we like the shadow and the anima and the archetypes a little more. And this one I had to prepare a little more for it to have something cogent to say. And what's interesting is what struck me through that process was I was reminded, and one of the reasons I fell in love with Jung's work is not only because of the discrete, tangible solutions to life challenges that I've gotten through that work, but also because he'll raise a lot of interesting questions that lead to more inquiry and investigation. And that really happened with me through this process of reading. And I'm hoping this little section I have can not only answer some questions about the persona, but also create a further discussion and some questions in all of us. So, you know, like my fellow panelists, I wanted to kind of start with images of the persona, maybe in culture or in art. Some of my favorite are in Greek mythology, the garment of Deianira, which Jung references, is Hercules dies by getting constricted by this garment. And Jung uses that as an image of sometimes our roles and obligations can choke the life out of us, and they can even kill the mightiest of heroes. So that's one image. Also, one that I find quite interesting is the picture of Dorian Gray. And so Dorian Gray has these garish costumes and the stylish clothes, lavish lifestyle on the outside, but on the inside, he's rotting and decaying. I always thought that was a provocative image. And then I have to admit, my panelists did a much more unique job with their film suggestions for this. I just have to go with the film Persona, by Ingmar Bergman, which is directly influenced by Jung's concept of the persona. It's a really fascinating film. A question that I was thinking as I was watching it is he just poses a very basic question: is the face in the mirror real? And is what is real about our identities? Very provocative film, and I think it's very apropos of the persona, Jung's persona. And then I'll just say, personae itself, the Latin for mask, and I think this is a very interesting idea that our costume we wear with various cultural signifiers to show the world what we are. The selection of a picture, like Skip said, to denote some kind of knowledge about Jung, these just cultural signifiers that can be thought of as a kind of costume, and I think that's very, very interesting. So finally segueing into what is the persona, and for Jung, I think there are kind of two sources of this: are expectations and demands from society, and the family system, the habits and routines that emerge because of that, the making sure you're behaving appropriately. And also an interesting one he mentions is the consenting to certain beliefs about the propositions of the nature of reality. So various religious things that we might say we believe, and it's kind of stop there. And I think that becomes a really important question for him later in life, the religious persona, which I think is interesting. And then also, interestingly enough, social ambitions and our goals, aims, and aspirations. That can be another aspect of the persona that I think is kind of interesting. Another Bergman film is Fanny and Alexander, which there's this fantastic scene. He lives with the protagonist lives with a bishop, and the bishop has a dream that he's trying to take his face off, and his face is fused. And it to me was always this image of your role becoming fused to your ego and not being able to disidentify. So how can the second question, how does it serve to impress others? And I think this is a fascinating question, like George was saying, and I think the direction I wanted to go with this one is the problems that Jung identifies with a pathological persona. And the first one is identification. So when our various attitudes and people in our lives, we become identified with them for our individual personality. This can lead to social conformity. And another book that I found absolutely fascinating on this was Cultural Attitudes by Joseph L. Henderson. Cultural Attitudes. Now, Henderson is an interesting figure. The book A Man and His Symbols, he's one of the co-writers of that. Now, the other co-writers are von Franz and Jaffe, and they're kind of more popular in the wider Jungian community. Dr. Henderson's a great thinker, and I would suggest that book, because he talks a lot about attitudes and how attitudes we have to certain things become unconscious and latent. Meaning, how we're supposed to be at home or at work just becomes, through behavioral learning, automatic and habitual. And if we're not able to become conscious of that, we can become identified with those attitudes. It's a very interesting idea. And of course, this can stunt our potential if it's in conflict with our goals towards individuation, the things we're passionate about, things we're fascinated. If they're in conflict with those attitudes, that can be a big problem. Another thing outside of identification, Jung sometimes calls it inflation. He may also call it anima or animus possession. This is actually a persona problem, which I think is interesting. It's talking about when there's a problem with the persona, when you realize that the persona is not what it's made out to be, kind of a weakening of the persona. Yeah, it's a very interesting idea. He talks about, in particular, a businessman who one aspect of this is can be a regression of the persona. So a businessman who loses everything, and he then instead of just getting back up and trying again, decides to take a lower role, and kind of a diminished persona. And Jung, Faust is a big text for Jung. and Goethe's Faust. And Faust, after he has his encounter with the devil, decides, he's like, I can't be an intellectual anymore. I just need to be a farmer. So it's talking about a kind of diminishing of your persona, of what you're capable of. And then also inflation, like I had mentioned, which is a kind of exaggerated self-importance, saying, you know, this role, I'm bigger than that. I'm identified with this archetypal characteristic, and I don't need to care about my family obligations, my societal obligations, etc. Completely discounting that and kind of flipping into the opposite direction of persona identification. And then lastly, I'll just say, I'll just say on how can we work with the persona and find some individuality, find some individuation. This topic, our wider panel, our wider discussion together is on individuation. So how does that kind of fit in? And oftentimes, some bad news on this one, but it often comes from a rock bottom moment. And so when the persona is absolutely obliterated because we didn't see it coming. And so, you know, a breakup, getting fired. A DUI is a very common one. I work in addiction recovery. So a DUI, a kind of taste of reality. The classic Jungian moment is when Freud breaks up with Jung and is thrown into chaos. And the persona of of Jung's work in psychoanalysis is thrown into chaos, and the Red Book emerges. I'll say the good news is I'm working on, when in my work in addiction, we always talk about before rock bottom, and you know, what does that look like? And I think this is, I'll end with this. I think this is a radical idea in Jungian psychology. Actually, is we focus on consciousness, becoming conscious. So, what is the persona I'm wearing? And Jung often talks about wear your persona. But do it consciously. Make sure these attitudes are not habitual and unconscious. And I'll just maybe end on, you know, investigate. We can investigate our values, goals, and virtues and determine if they're coming from obligation or something we're fascinated by. And with that, I'll just say, you know, with that in mind, with those virtues in mind, wear your persona in pursuit of that, and don't let it wear you. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. All right, now the panelists get to raise one question for the other panelists. Brian, do you want to go first? Do you have any question that you would like to ask?
I do. The question I want to ask is, what do the panelists think about what's the proper balance between our need for uniqueness and individuation and our often our emotional need for connection and relatedness? What's the proper balance there?
Depends on the situation and the terrain. Standard Marine Corps answer. There's no defined answer to that, but you can't be all one or all the other. That's clear.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Skip. It's for me, it's always and Jung talks about it's always idiosyncratic, and it's highly dynamic. And I hope it is, because that's the only way you can have some sort of meaning in life, with this emergence of change, constant change. So the homeostasis is always it's highly dynamic.
Excellent. George, do you have questions for the other two?
Yeah, I guess what's one advantage of having a persona, and what's a disadvantage of having a persona?
Well, I think an advantage of having a persona is just, so I think of, you know, when it comes to the unconscious, being able to go, one thing that was radical about rereading Jung on the personas, he was talking about how unconscious the persona is and the differentiation between the ego and the persona, and how it is actually very similar to the shadow, and how it's differentiated from the ego. And I think one of the advantages of having that is, like, when we're going through a checkout line and we just say, I'm great, how are you? And that very habitual, easy answer that is helps us with social awkwardness. And I think that's a huge advantage. And I think one of the disadvantages is, I mean, in my life, I find myself sometimes not really connecting with people because I'm too worried about what they're going to think. And so if I'm in a social environment, instead of asking interesting, probing questions, I'm talking about, something like the weather, to try to be safe.
Okay. Let me address that one, and also in connection with how individuality emerges from under the persona. And let me talk about it in terms of my Marine Corps career, what I know about it. Because one of the things that happened is that I went to 4 senior schools, and in every senior school, they give the MBTI and spend a day explaining the MBTI to senior officers. I'm talking about lieutenant colonel and above, typically. But in the military, everybody wears their persona on their chest. Okay, so on your shoulders, you have your pecking order, and on your left breast, you have sort of your resume. Think of it that way. how you got to your pecking order is your resume that's on your chest. And they did some research on officers that went to high rank, and they discovered that 95% of all admirals and generals are STJ. That means they are very good at getting details. They're very good at thinking about it, and they're very good at executing based on what they figure out or what the mission is. And those guys typically max out at 2 stars. But the guys that get to 4 stars, people like Mattis, like John Kelly, and so on, and Colin Powell is the classic example of this. These are guys that know how to play the politics, and the trick is that you have to. And I'm not an STJ. I'm an NTP, and so what I learned because of through training in the Marine Corps, I learned how to play the role of an STJ officer. And all these officers that get to these top ranks have to do that. But what's unique about them is that younger Marines will often come to you and say, I don't want to play the politics. I don't care about the politics. Just tell me what to do. Tell me what my mission is. I will go execute it for you perfectly. And then they do. Okay. So at those levels, 2-star and below, they're part of a perfect weapon, basically. The weapon is told what to do, it goes and does it, comes back, aye, sir, mission accomplished. But, and the people who are able to play the politics have to hide behind that persona for most of their career, and only let it start to emerge that they're prepared to play the politics at senior levels, usually colonel and above. But my classmate Oliver North was one who liked to play the politics right from the start, and he advanced very quickly. He had the same date of rank as I had as a second lieutenant, but by the time he was a lieutenant colonel, he had a date of rank 10 months earlier than mine. So he was a whole year group ahead of me. And so what happens is that these officers who know the politics start to emerge out from under the persona, and they start to take over. And so, you know, a perfect example is Colin Powell, and you saw him as he became Secretary of State. And so what's an advantage? An advantage is that you can hide behind this persona. You can put your uniform on and You know, if I put my uniform on and I still have it in the closet, I can be an STJ. But the disadvantage is that people expect me to be an STJ, and that's not what I am. So anyway.
Thank you. Skip, do you have a question for George and Brian? Or we can get to questions from the audience.
Why don't we go to questions
Sounds
from the
good.
audience?
Okay.
I didn't think about this in
That's
advance,
fine.
Shrikant, so I'm
That's
sorry.
fine. That's fine. No problem at all. All right. So it's going to be Steve, Okami, Julie, Peter, V, Catherine, Dustin, Ayala, John R, Taylor, Dom, and Faisal next. Okay. So the rules are very simple. Whenever you have a question, you can either type in a question or type in an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. That's rule number one. Rule number two, keep on topic. We're talking about persona today. Number three, be brief. And number four, be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything, but please be courteous doing that. All right, Steve, you're next.
Okay, so well, first of all, thanks to the panel and thanks to Shrikant for organizing everything as usual. To me, when I think about persona, I tend to think of the way in which we need to adopt persona to exist and do well in institutions, and the extent to which we need to appear as though we've internalized the value system of our tribe. So my question pertains largely to one of my favorite Jungian texts, which is The Undiscovered Self. And that is basically that Jung warns against the tendency of creed and doctrine to crush the light of wisdom that is still capable within the individual. That's a rough quote. Everything is political today, even COVID-19. And it seems that the tendency towards political tribe is getting worse. So I want to ask the panel, what is your take / what is Jung's take on the steps that an individual can begin to undergo to avoid the strengthening of persona in an age in which everything seems to divide us on one side of the line of an argument or another?
I can check. It's a great question. Thank you. It's a very probing question. I think, and it's very interesting that it's been probed in relationship, or you're asking in relationship to a panel on persona, because I think that is a good way to feel our way into it. And I think really taking some of these political issues and decoupling the concept of ideology from our citizenship. Like, citizenship's an old-fashioned word, but this idea of looking at issues and consciously engaging them individually and reasoning your way through them, as opposed to kind of sorting our beliefs based on ideological grounds. I think that is the kind of essence of working on these political issues. And even and I think Jung's way to do that was less so like political and more so psychological. What does this? He reasoned through issues psychologically, and was pretty. It's hard to pin him down ideologically. But people love him on the left and on the right, and that's because I think he had an individual answer for each. For different questions, and I think that's how I would approach it, and I think that's how Jung kind of approached it in his life as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I think for me, I think Jung comes from a almost like the Frankfurt School and the critical theory. For me, particularly, Steve, volume 10, I think he's a critical theorist. Jung. With regards to personae performance, because yes, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the persona, just like the anima, is the relating function. So externally, it allows us to adapt. There's a tension. There's a tension between ego and collective consciousness, and it's facilitated it's managed by personae, and I'm not sure if one has to scaffold one's persona. So you can argue that. I think one needs to be scaffolding with regards to persona-centric work is the ego. The persona lays on the ego, although it comes from without, it lays on the ego. And if the ego is not scaffolded, the persona will collapse. Okay, because there is a neurosis, a deep, intense neurosis between ego. Neurosis emerges from tension of opposites. In this case, ego with collective consciousness. There's a lot of anxiety there. And I think what needs support mostly is not personae, or persona in particular, with regards to advocating and being an activist, no matter what the conditions are. I think the psychic structure that needs support is the ego with regards to effective personae functioning.
Okay, I think it's very tough to break out of persona. And every time I did, it was because of trauma. So I became a Marine Corps officer, and then I became a student, a law student, and then I became a lawyer. Then I became a business executive. But while I was being a lawyer, I was also a teacher and a student. And so I had 4 personas going. I was the company commander of my local reserve unit. I was a practicing attorney and presenting myself as in the persona of an attorney. I was teaching 2 classes in a local college, and I was in business school as a student, all at the same time. And there was one particular time when I was pulling out of the Reserve Center in Rochester, New York, and I had to pull the car over because my mind just went blank. And I couldn't, for the life of me, think about where I was going. And I literally, or what I was doing, I literally had to pull the car over, close my eyes, and just let my mind reboot before I could actually do anything. And so with the Marine Corps, the last thing I did in uniform was break my leg. So you're done on that. With the student, I sort of played it out to the end. I went to 10 years of higher education. With the lawyer, I loved going to law school as a student, but when I got into the practice of law, I found I detested the business of law. I found I detested the profession. And so in all those cases, I basically had to have a trauma to break out of the persona, because you tend to build up personas to represent who you are in the world. And people have an expectation. You know, if you're a priest, you have to present yourself as a priest. If you're a doctor, you have to wear scrubs and have a white coat, that sort of thing. And everybody expects you to be a certain thing. And it's very hard not to be that. And it's very hard to juggle them, as I found out.
Thank you, Skip. So it's going to be Julie, Peter, and Catherine next. Julie, go ahead. When you have a question, when you're asked to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself, ask the question, and then mute yourself again. Julie, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Thank you to the panelists. This is really interesting. My question, it actually has kind of evolved from what I'd originally typed in. I think what I'm hearing and wondering about is individuation as a kind of a process of becoming, to me, I would like to say, more authentic. And I'm interested in how much, it sounds like what I'm learning from y'all is that the persona is largely unconscious, if not entirely unconscious. So what questions would a person ask themselves, or how how would we recognize if we're uncomfortable with a persona? I mean, I'm hearing Skip talk about kind of you had to come to some tragic ends and traumas to kind of get out of those personas, disidentify with that. Is there something, how does, I guess, I'm not asking this well, what does the ego, do we have a choice about our persona, and can we work toward a more authentic or individuation process kind of deliberately? But if it's all unconscious and happening, how can we kind of work with that? I guess I'll just stop there. Throw that out. Thank you very much.
It's an awesome question, Julie. Thank you. I think there are ways to. I think you mentioned the difficulty because of the unconscious, the often unconscious nature of the persona, and I do think there are good reasons for that, because kind of like I was mentioning in the really kind of boring example of customer service interactions, there's a great utility to having something kind of habitual like that. However, I do think there are. I think this is there's a really interesting convergence here with Jungian depth psychology, analytical psychology, and behaviorism, which are usually, they're kind of odd bedfellows. They're usually in kind of tension. But, you know, John Watson of the fame of Little Albert actually published his first work in the same year that Jung was working on the Red Book. So I think we could make that association, but I digress. I think we have to work with the persona more skillfully. We have to become aware of, you know, what are the roles we're playing, like bring that to consciousness. And then also, what does fascinate me? Where is my individuation process and my personal development going? And trying to, you know, find a convergence there. I think the difficulty is oftentimes behavioral, and the fact that you know there's an inertia to making changes and exposing ourselves to new environments or new attitudes in when there's various cues that remind us to act how we used to act before. So I think that is really the difficulty. On one hand, you know, becoming conscious of, you know, where am I moving in my life, in the soul? Where's my soul moving? And then also, you know, changing our behavior in external environments to try to align with that, to put ourselves in situations where maybe, you know, if we're relating to people in the external world, you know, that's going to kind of facilitate more depth for the soul. And I think that is definitely something we can do. And I actually don't think we need to like maybe in some religious traditions we'll say, like, you know, beg, like just get rid of the persona, like become. You can do that. No judgment there, but I think we can also wear our persona to get us closer to wear our persona consciously to align it with what our soul is calling us to do. So fantastic question.
Just quickly, by the way, I like how you preface your comments, Julie, by saying how your question evolved. I think that's fantastic. I think your question, if I understood it correctly, is alluding to will. Where does the faculty of will rely? And I would claim that will always, if it does exist, and I believe, you know, I subscribe to that proposition, it resides within the ego. It does not reside within the personae. I think if you conflate, I think it speaks to the value that one has to cultivate an attitude that there's a difference between personae and ego. And if you conflate your ego with your persona, you are abdicating your will by definition. I think one needs to perform, to recognize that one is adapting to the external world, to collective conscious, to personae, yet recognize that choice resides within the ego. And if one operates existentially with the presumption that ego is within the persona, then you're setting yourself up to a breakdown. You're going to have a neurotic breakdown. That's my claim.
I think that the best way to know what yourself wants, and I kid you not, yourself is your boss, whether you like it or not. And if you don't do what yourself wants, you are going to be neurotic and have a hard time. And Dr. Jung was very emphatic that you need to use your creativity to hear what your self wants in some way. And so I think that if you don't have an artistic approach to something, and it doesn't matter what it is, it can be painting, sculpture, dance, woodworking. Dr. Jung built the house behind me with his bare hands. He was a stonemason and a stone sculpture, among other things. He did many, many different things, and he painted all the pictures in the Red Book. But by doing that, he was able to hear himself. And so a good tactic that I think you could use is go to a cooking store or Michael's for art stuff, or go to Sears tool department, depending on who you are and what interests you. Go to one of those stores first, select which one you're going to go to. Then go to that store and see what speaks to you. Okay, it could be a chainsaw, or it could be, watercolors, or it could be a fantastic cookbook, and just hear what your psyche is telling you it wants to work with. Now, in my case, I do one thing every day without fail, and that is I make an omelet for my wife. And the reason I do that is because when I wake up, my brain is not functioning, okay? And in order to get the communication going between myself and my ego, I go to a creative act, which is creating this omelet. And I more or less do it the same way every day. And sometimes I mess it up, but it's a little different. But anyway, by the time that omelet is served to my wife, I've gotten my brain engaged, and I've listened to my unconscious about how to go about doing this creative act. And I think that that's a terrific way to hear your unconscious. And the point at the bottom is that you better hear your unconscious, because if you don't, it's going to whack you someday. Okay. I mean, if I had asked Edward Edinger, Carl Jung, how my accident occurred when I broke my leg on Marine Corps Base Quantico, they would say that's myself telling me it doesn't want me to do that anymore. Okay. And it led me to this tonight. So, and when I started the YouTube channel, I always do it based on what I think is the thing for the day that I need to be putting out.
Thank you. Thank you, Skip. This is a question from Wesley from Singapore. He's requested that I read it out. He asked the same question last time. We couldn't get to it. The question is Jungian or analytical psychology one of these 5 things? Number 1, is it the be all and end all? Number 2, is it a bridge or a stepping stone to reality? Number 3, somewhere in between? 4, none of the above? Or 5, mix of all the above?
Okay, this is a really fascinating question. I'd like to take a stab at this one. First of all, it's a big question. I think we could discuss it for a long time. It seems to me, this could be my own interpretation, but it strikes me as a kind of religious question, or a really deeply philosophical question about the nature of reality. And I think what's interesting about Jung, I think I'm going to say none of the above. This is something that I'm really interested in. This question, and it's a question that reminds me of one that the editor of Jung, the Red Book, Jung's Red Book, by the name of Sonu Shamdasani, he put me onto this, and it's that Jungian psychology is actually a study of the psychology or religious making process. So how, if to answer this question, typically in a religious sense, a mystic or a prophet or a spiritual person receives some kind of revelation from the divine. Similarly, scientists in some way, you know, they receive an idea from the ether of, let's test this. Like, where do hypotheses come from? And I think Jungian psychology is studying how the psychological processes behind making symbols to understand these kind of experiences. And so maybe we could either say it's none of those questions, or it's a bridge to understanding reality by maybe helping us in a comparative sense say, okay, people who are interested in these questions, here are the similarities in their experiences, here are the differences, and maybe that can help us learn more about that process and move closer to one, recognizing a kind of more universal truth, or two, understanding that that is going to be elusive to us forever. Whatever the answer is, Jungian psychology maybe can help us understand that by looking at the meaning-making process itself. Excellent question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question. Go ahead, Skip.
Oh, there's much more to be discussed here. we can't brush it off. Okay, the key about all of this goes back to ancient Greece and the Oracle of Delphi over the door, and also on the seal of my college are the words in Greek, know thyself. And what Jungian psychology is about that, okay, above all things. And, you know, if you use in my opinion, and I'm not a psychologist, thankfully, so I hope I don't offend my friends, but I don't think you can use statistics to know yourself, okay? In other words, you know, the treatments for depression, et cetera, these days are ruled by certain traditions in the psychiatric arena that might involve pharmaceuticals and so on. And I think if you're taking a pharmaceutical, you're not knowing yourself, okay? Not at all. And so I think that there are certainly proper places where you can use them, and you know, that's way beyond my pay grade, and I wouldn't even try to address that because I'm not a psychologist. So it's not the be all end all, but for me, it has been on the spiritual side. And so it's a stepping stone to understanding where you are in a spiritual sense. And interestingly, I just had a revelation in the last week that I'll share with you, which is that traditionally people talk about Dr. Jung as coming back from the East. He went to India once for 3 months, I think, about 6 weeks of which he was in the hospital, but in any case, he was there. And he came back and he said, well, it's not right for us to talk about the East because we were built based on a different rhizome, the Judeo-Christian rhizome, and therefore we shouldn't talk about the East. And my insight this last weekend was that he actually realized that from a spiritual point of view, the East is far ahead of where the Judeo-Christian world is. And he recognized he had so much work to do to upgrade Christianity and upgrade Judaism, and by association update Islam, that he just decided, you know, the Indians are fine just as they are, and we ought to just see what we can do to bring Christianity along. And I got this insight for some reason. I got a push. My psyche told me to buy the Bhagavad Gita, which I did. Okay, and I bought 2 copies for whatever reason. But I opened the Penguin Classic to page 116, I think, and that's in the 10th discourse of the Bhagavad Gita. And actually starting with verse 19. And I realized that the Bhagavad Gita, which writes down a tradition that goes back 5,000 years in India and was actually put down in formal way between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century AD, actually describes what Jung means by the self very thoroughly. Okay, from Discourse 10, from verse 19 on, Krishna explains completely what the self is, or, pretty completely. I never saw anybody do it better than that. And so I think that one reason to look at Jung is to understand spiritual aspects and to understand yourself. And he certainly has helped me over many years now, decades, with my animus toward Christianity, which now I'm back, but not really as a Christian anymore, more as a Jungian. But I joke that, Nietzsche said God is dead, and Nietzsche was right. That God was dead and is dead and never was, actually. But Jung found where God lives and how he goes about doing the business of the Godhead, and found that God lives, and so that is the essential contribution of Jung, and it has to do with spirituality. That's my opinion, anyway.
Wow, Skip, that was amazing. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Peter, you're next. Peter, go ahead and unmute yourself, and you can ask your question.
How's that?
Go ahead.
You got me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I collected a certain number of points here, and I don't know how well they link up together with each other, but the question about persona and how clear and how strong the persona is a thing which is confusing to me in this. I think one of the things I've always wanted to be is a person who has no persona at all. And a person, I always imagine someone like Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. You have this guy walking around in a loincloth all the time. And I mean, he seemed to just talk to everybody exactly the same way. And that seemed to be a very enviable type of person. But on the other hand, we're talking about people, I think it was Skip who was talking about Colin Powell, or I think about other celebrities who create a very strong persona. And I suppose they fall, in many cases, victim to this strong persona. As I think George was saying, or something, would that be the case? As celebrities, they believe their persona is themselves.
Thank you. Who would like to take the question?
If there was a question.
Well,
Yeah, my answer is yes, but go on.
I'll just make a quick remark. I think with regards to celebrities, I think that's one aspect that occurs to celebrities. They become addicted to their persona. But I think also what happens with regards to, and I'm going to change the wording of some of your phrasing. I think the charismatic aspect with celebrities is really when they get overwhelmed by archetypal material, what Jung calls mana personalities. So I think that's something else. So I just want to respond, not to answer, but to respond to your question, that I think you're pointing to a phenomenon that has two aspects. One is persona addiction, and the other one is being overwhelmed by archetypal energies, and what Jung calls mana personality, due to a weak ego. So again, I think in order to manage persona material and to kind of filter archetypal fumes, we go back to the ego. Again, the paramount, the key positioning of the ego needs to moderate. I mean, the ego is a hero. It's incredible what the ego it needs to be hygienic. in order to grapple with persona material and transpersonal material, so not to get overwhelmed. I'm not answering your question. I'm just responding to that particular remark. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. So it's going to be Catherine Park, Dustin, and Ayala next. Try to keep your comments or questions brief so we can get to as many questions and as many comments as we can. Catherine
Okay.
Park, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Go ahead.
Okay. I just had some questions, like, for example, trends in society. You know, like, are there some sort of predictable trends in society where the populace has a strong persona as a, you know, as a society, and then weak as a society? I was thinking, like, in terms of chivalry, you know, you had a lot of persona, you know, you're supposed to act that way. But now in the current culture with internet, people are hiding behind masks and such. So, you know, they can say whatever they want, which makes me think like that they don't have such a persona, like they don't care because they have that anonymity. And then also I noticed, like, there's a lot of shame culture nowadays, like these kind of survivor type of, you know, elimination. You know, they're like always making, like, it seems like they're trying to cut through your persona and just get in there to cause damage and things like that, you know. Well, I don't know, that's kind of a random question, but it just came up to me. Sorry if it was kind of too long.
No, thank you, Catherine. It's a great
Sure.
question, and I hope my panelists don't mind me jumping in and take it, because I think it's interesting about the predictive capabilities that you're talking about. I don't know if I could offer any kind of predictive capabilities, but I do think you're touching on a really important aspect of Jung's work. With he talks about in the Red Book the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depth. And I think these cultural trends that you're kind of you're recognizing that, hey, you know, now it seems like maybe I'm kind of putting words in your mouth, but society's a bit more narcissistic. Before it was a bit more chivalrous. And I think what Jung is trying to point at with the spirit of the times is that shifts. It shifts. And we can see, like, look at the clothes we used to wear in like the 90s and the 80s. It looks silly to us now, but it was so cool then. That's a very just boring example. But it's also the same with scientific trends and things that seem really real. Scientifically, we look at in 40 years later and we're like, oh, we were really off there. Things have really evolved. But yet there is certain, for Jung, there's certain archetypal qualities that weave in and out of all of these situations and finding those within the culture. And so, like, I'll often advocate for taking a look at something like Survivor or reality TV show, things that people put their nose up to usually, and seeing what is going on with, why are we fascinated by this archetypally? What is at the core of this? And your proposition that there might be something to do with cutting down the persona is an intriguing one. And I think a great example of that, but that's how I would respond. I think looking at the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths would be the interesting way into that. And I do think the spirit of the times is usually, or our need to acquiesce to it is usually a persona function as opposed to something deeper.
Okay.
Thank you.
Skip, you're saying something. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to comment on anonymity, which really started to emerge in the late 80s when the internet really got rolling. World Wide Web not till 95, but I think people hide behind a mask, maybe something that they wish they were, or you know, any random mask, but those people haven't completed the hero's journey yet. Okay. and so those people are also not ready for individuation. Okay, because the point was Jung wanted to talk to people in the second half of life who had completed the buildup of their ego. And he really felt that if people started on that process too young, maybe we're more precocious 100 years later than we were in 1920. But you know, if you're 18, you haven't done your hero's journey yet. You haven't built up your ego enough to be strong enough to face the crisis that you face in the world. And we're problem-solving creatures. And first you have to learn how to solve problems. Okay, that's what education's about. And then we spend the rest of our lives solving problems. We solve them all day long, every day, each one of us. And so you don't want to dig down into that unconscious level until you know what you're doing a little bit. You know, and that's the hero's journey of building your ego up to the point where you can cope, right?
Dustin, you're next. Dustin, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I appreciate it.
Go ahead.
What is the ego? What is the persona? What's the relationship between neurosis and these aspects of the psyche? And what are one or two of the most effective or advocated means as a way to dissolve this neurosis, as advocated by Jung?
Well, maybe I'll start with the last one. I think my other panelists can answer the question on ego and persona better, but I want to kind of flip the script a little bit on Dustin about dissolving neurosis. I think, you know, especially in Jung's later work on alchemy, neurosis is an achievement. And that's a provocative idea, but we tend in the Jungian world not to pathologize neurosis. And this is our creative problem. You're anxious? Great, wonderful, let's work with that. That's your prima materia. Congratulations. Oh, you had an affair? Great news. Fantastic. Let's work on that. That's your prima materia. It is kind of compensation to some other forms of psychology that might be like, that might perhaps, you know, pathologize this thing and say this is something we need to fix. It's actually an essential part of the process itself. And I think, you know, looking at Jung's work on alchemy is interesting because the black stage is an achievement. It's about time you got there. It's about time we've decided that we're neurotic. Kind of famously, there's an anecdote where someone would come in analysis with Jung and say, "Hey, I just got a raise. Isn't this great?" Jung would be like, "I'm really sorry to hear that. That's awful." And then vice versa, someone would come in with something to grieve, and he'd be like, "Congratulations, this is the best day of your life. I'm excited for this next phase for you." And so I think that's maybe a bit of the trickster aspect of Jungian psychology when it comes to neurosis, is we tend to like it.
I just want to say that again, thank you. These questions are awesome. They really they're compelling me to think critically, to dig in. Dustin, just quickly, I do want to say that and piggyback what Brian just said. For Jung, neurosis is there's a teleos. He focused on its purpose. There is no pathology in analytical psychology. He doesn't dismiss it, but it seldom composes the attitude towards symptoms and towards existential challenges. So neurosis is an opportunity for one to change, for one to transform. So if you feel a tension between the ego and your persona, and it's too overwhelming, well, change your persona. It's time to change. You know, leave your neighborhood. Do something. Address the neurosis in a mature manner. Don't react to it. Respond to it. It's an opportunity. It's a crisis for change. I just want to say that. I think I want to frame it that way. I also want to say that it actually underscores the utility of the persona. And again, what Brian said earlier, personas don't remain the same. They change from generation to generation. Thank God. But that's challenging, particularly within an orthodox context. Anyway, okay.
Thank you, George. So next up is going to be Ayala, John R., Dom, Faisal, Duncan, Ron W., Candace, Kristen, Marco, and Catherine. Ayala, go ahead. Ayala? Okay, let's take the next one. John R.
Yeah, no, I'm okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, it's a continuation of the previous discussion in which the tension between persona and ego looked at in a negative way even as far as the telos. I can understand as a therapist myself that as a psychotherapist, you don't look at neurosis or at a problem of inner schism as negative. It's even exciting for a psychotherapist, but I'm not sure it is for the client. So I'm wondering other perspectives which, let's say existential psychotherapy, look at this tension as good as a source of authenticity, and the telos is that it will bring change. It is not, the persona itself is looked as a sabotage or as an obstacle to authenticity, or here the ego. How do you, as Jungians, how do you look at it?
Well, thank you, Ayala, for the really probing, interesting question. I think when it comes to persona and ego, I have to go as a Jungian maybe to the book of Exodus. I believe it's Exodus chapter 3 in some point. God comes to Moses, Yahweh comes to Moses and says, "I am that I am." And a lot of one of my favorite Vedantic teachers, Ramana Maharshi, even talks about that as being the purest spiritual utterance that's come out of the religions is "I am," which he relates to just being, and am being. And I think Jung takes this with I, and I think George has alluded to this with the I being a heroic function, the ego. And if we associate that with I, it's the I as an individual am being. Gives the ego a really, it's a heroic version, a vision of the ego. And then I think the persona, we start, it bleeds into I am that, like I am Brian, my name. I am a Marine Corps officer. I am a psychotherapist. And the persona, insofar as it limits that being, that amness, the potentiality, or what we would call the self-archetype as Jungians, it is limiting. And there is a tension there because ultimately that kind of spiritual vision as self, as being, is fundamental to Jung. It's becoming conscious of that in all of life's various ebbs and flows. And I think that is the fundamental tension as we can find that awareness and being within these situations, so-called neurotic situations, great. And insofar as they keep us from seeing that, they're troubling.
Ayala, I agree with you. I think it's existential. I mean, the struggle between authenticity and inauthenticity, embrace it. It's pure subjectivity. You need to embrace it. It's difficult, again, if you're operating within orthodox conditions. If you have these rigid expectations, and what I call an addiction to persona. I think the struggle between authenticity and inauthenticity is a perennial one. And one needs to adopt an attitude of acceptance. And that's easier said than done, because I agree with you. With regard from the perspective from the client, it's difficult.
Skip, did you have anything? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I also wanted to go back to Dustin's question a little bit because, man, Dustin, you just asked a question that's covered in 20 volumes of the collected works. and so there's no quick, simple answer. But I think there's a few things that stick in my mind through my study, and that one of them is that a neurosis is never solved. It's never cured. It's you learn how to put a fence around it and put it over in this corner of the pasture and just don't go back there. That's one way to think about it. I mean, that's simplistic, and I don't assert that as a psychological clinical psychology answer. Okay, that's just my layman's answer. But neuroses normally come not in the case of ego persona issues, but in the case of ego self issues, because the ego is everything that's conscious, and the self is the unconscious. And the unconscious is in charge. That's what Jung called the 2 million year old man, but is actually the 3.5 billion year old man, because we're all descended from single-celled organisms. And all of our ancestors going back that far did two things successfully. They survived until they reproduced, every single one of them. None of them failed, because we wouldn't be here in that otherwise. And so Jung was always about, in terms of solving neurotic problems, was always about reconnecting the ego with the self in some way. And that's why the emphasis on creativity, for example, because by being creative, you are, being like God. God created the heavens and the earth. Well, I created this table over here in my basement, whatever it is. But when you created that, you were creating, and that was yourself that was probably doing that. And there's a subtle shift. I mean, when I was learning to draw portraits, I was very, very persnickety about drawing all these hash places and trying to get it perfectly. But then I wanted to do a drawing of my parents, and they had beautiful photographs of themselves in 1945. So I tried to draw these photographs, and I'm going through the boxes, and that's a very ego type of thing to do. But at some point in the evening that I was doing this, it just flowed. It began to flow. And in the next 2 or 3 hours, I never paid any attention to the boxes. I just put what was coming from myself. And I have no recollection of actually doing it, but I did it. And my mother came down in the morning, and she looked at these 2 paintings, and she just silently put the photographs aside and put the paintings on the wall. And because obviously I struck a very deep chord in her by my painting of her and my father. And that came entirely from the self. And so you have to have that flow somehow between the ego and the self. And okay, a persona will come. I mean, if you're doing anything, you're going to have a persona. And if you're fighting it, let's put it this way. 1/3 of all men who come to OCS in the Marine Corps leave before the end of OCS. Okay, this is 1/3 of all men who think they can be a Marine Corps officer leave within 10 weeks and never come back. Okay, so, you think you can have a certain persona, and 1/3 of all those who think they cannot. Okay, they just can't. And that statistic has been constant throughout my career anyway, as far as I know. So anyway,
Thank you.
For what it's worth.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Next question is from John R. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? I'm on a headphone.
Yes.
Now, I'm having fun with this. This is great fun, and so I really appreciate the insights everyone is sharing. I have a kind of a challenge based on my discovery and my explorations into these topics. From my point of view, or at least my explorations, that discovering or encountering Jungian psychology was something that came up fairly new in the mid 20th century. And for many people, the initial exposure to what is Jungian psychology was through the popular book Man and His Symbols. And in Man and His Symbols, if I'm not oversimplifying this, the persona is really the opening introduction to the possibility of the self. And the persona is a kind of a archetypal manifestation that arises and has a certain importance, but then gives way to other understandings. And the succinct progression that is described at length in Man and His Symbols is when somebody opens up these inquiries, the persona will be the first experience. The shadow and the dangers of the shadow will be a next experience. Then will arise the anima or animus, and that will be the next level of experience. And then as one advances further, the self will begin to emerge. And Jung also cautioned, and Jung often corrected himself. So one can't really rely totally on these doctrinaire or classical or orthodox points of view to say this is the way things have to be. But Jung also said that nobody should mess with these deep analytical psychologies until the last half of your life. You should spend the first half of your life just doing what you need to do to survive and make your family happen and establish your home and your livelihood. And then in the last half of life, you can start developing these more prominent, these deep ideas. But when he opened up his school in Zurich, he was shocked because all these young people were coming from America who just wanted to learn their analytical psychology, and they wanted to start when they were in their 20s and 30s, and there they were, and they were very anxious and ready to go. And I think that's a kind of an interesting dynamic that has continued. But anyway, I think the brief question out of all of that background is isn't the persona just a kind of a entry point into understanding oneself and beginning to open up inquiries into some more of these other possibly more complex and more compelling aspects of the personality? Thank you.
Thank you, John. Very fascinating question. I think, yeah, Man and His Symbols definitely commend that one forward as well. Something that I think is important to just explore here with Jung is there's this one thing that has always stuck with me from the Red Book is this really provocative quote of have you counted the murderers among the scholars? He says, and Jung also talks a lot about how theories are the devil in psychology, and to be really careful with schematic theories and that they're very provisional. And he kind of, I think, really this common term we use in the philosophical discourse now, the map might not describe the territory very well. It can, but oftentimes there can be a gap there. I think we just have to keep that in mind when discussing these kind of really important and interesting questions. Because what happens if you're a 19-year-old young man and you're having dreams of the goddess and you didn't deal with the persona? Well, you're having dreams of the goddess. That's what we're going to have to deal with. And just because it didn't fall into this this idea, this schematic doesn't mean that experience is invalid. And I think it's kind of interesting, a really provocative and I think important claim that or idea that Skip was sharing is, statistical aggregates and averages, they're not describing an individual. The idiosyncratic, I think, is really important for Jung. And we might see 100 patients and maybe 63 of them deal with the persona first. And so we write in an introductory book to Jungian psychology, hey, you're going to deal with the persona first. But what if you're in that group that doesn't deal with them? We don't need to shoehorn that experience into the averages if that's your experience. So I think we can kind of hold that tension in, hold them both. We can recognize, hey, sometimes a lot of people experience these general principles, but also, analytical psychology is very idiosyncratic as well.
John, you did a great description regarding the linear progress, at least I think so. But I do want to say that Jung would also agree with you. before you do any depth psychology, any investigation with the unconscious, personal unconscious, then collective, Jung calls it the anamnestic analysis. And most of his people he worked with, that's where he stayed. I mean, when we read, visions about Christina Morgan, those are few cases. Most of his work was with people who were grappling with the tension between ego and persona and the collective consciousness. And that's what most of us spend our lives in, grappling with that material. Very few of us bother to, either with intention or without intention, grapple with shadow material and then transpersonal material. So I would say yes. When one is experiencing some degree of anxiety, some sort of discomfort with one's existential disposition, Jung will and I would agree, you need to begin to start with conscious material, and that's ego with persona, and see if that resolves. He calls that an amnestic analysis first. Then, if that does, once you exhaust that, then you get into unconscious material. But you got to grapple with conscious stuff, because as I said earlier, if you're paranoid that people are after you, there's a good chance there are people going after you. So grapple with that, and now with unconscious material.
Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that people are trying to get you.
Yeah. Sorry if I butchered that.
I agree with that entirely, and sometimes it's not easy to grapple with that. I mean, that was my point about my various personas. I could only change them traumatically when I had to. and I put 8 years into the law. I've put 23 years into the Marines, and I guess I'm still a teacher, but and I'm still a student, definitely. But finding the end of those things, or finding out whether that's really your persona and that's what you're going to be till the end of your life. If you look at, if you can imagine in your mind Sigmund Freud, he probably was pretty much like he was in 1907 when he died in 1939. He had a persona, and he had a specific dogma that he wanted to have followed, and that's where Jung broke with him, because he said, this dogma is too superficial, or it's not the right answer, actually.
Yeah, what I'd like to assert here is, in listening to your comments, Skip, I'm impressed because when you describe your own personal trajectory here, you talk about your experience in the Marines and the officer training and the very superficial expectations that people had about what was necessary to succeed at a baseline level. And then you said personally, you moved on to the next thing, and you were a student and a teacher. And so to me, you've kind of started, that suggests to me that you started with a kind of a sensation immersion. And then you decided that wasn't what you needed. You moved into a scholastic setting, and now you're in a thinking world. And you took that to a certain degree, and then you said, well, let's look at law for a while. Well, to me, at least in the Jungian definition of what is feeling, which is not necessarily emotionality, it's more formal than that, that law and practicing as an attorney is a feeling expression, especially an introverted feeling expression. And then you moved beyond that, and you kind of said, well, now let's go into a world where we're trying to mix this all up and do something real with it and work it all together. And so this is a very evocative life story, and I thank you very much for sharing it. Thank you.
Well, I think of it as I was very much in the logos. Okay, I was a believer in the word. Okay, John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So if I go learn all the words, whether it's the words of Marine Corps training or the words of law training or what have you, then I'm going to be set. Okay, what I found out was I wasn't set. And so the partner that I work with on something else came from the Eros end. He was an artist, but the two of us met in the middle. So I became an artist, and he suddenly has a flood of logos coming back, and we need balance between the two. So I came from all logos. I was, you know, in religion, we have to read beyond John 1:1. If you read John 2-14, you get an entirely different picture of Christianity.
Wow, this is such an amazing conversation. Okay, it's going to be Faisal, Duncan, and Ron W. next. Faisal, go ahead.
Okay, thank you guys all for the conversation so far. I mean, it's very, very interesting, and you know, I got a lot out of what I've heard so far. I'm still confused still with this idea of, you know, linear progression, you know, from the persona sort of fading out into the more of the ego, and you know, something came to mind about this idea of the marionettes, you know, like how marionettes have, you know, strings pulling in all directions. And I'm just wondering whether Jung approach any of that as, like, you know, you'd have string, you know, that leads to the persona, another strings that leads to the ego, another strings that leads to the archetypes and the unconscious, and how, you know, that actually influence one's you know, role in society. Because I feel like the persona is very much linked to you know, to how one evolves in society, in an environment. Obviously, like if you take somebody, you know, if you take the businessman and you put him in a tribe in the Amazon, it does affect how the persona is going to evolve, just because, you know, of the environment. And so that's why I'm curious about that, because I'm still not not in accordance with this idea of linear, just because I feel like, you know,
It's
we all
not
carry
linear.
different personas.
It's not
We
linear.
all carry different personas,
Yeah,
and we all have, you know, different.
my apologies. That was a poor phrasing I employed.
No, I mean, what you said, I really agree with this idea of adaptation. You know, we all adapt to society one way or another, and we do need a strong ego. But I'm just wondering whether Jung approach any of that topic within the realm of a you know, this idea of, you know, of pulled in different direction,
Okay.
and whether the individual is pulled in all these directions.
Let the panelists respond.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just explaining my,
Thanks.
you know, let me explain fully my question. Thank you.
Well, it's a great question. It's very interesting. I'm kind of thinking about this idea of, like, you know, perhaps linear or ordered process, and then being pulled in many different directions. I think it's very interesting because, you know, like we were clarifying, is it tends not to be very linear, and it can be very idiosyncratic. However, Jung does talk about like a mandala and a kind of order and a kind of harmony of the self. And I think this is an interesting idea. If you look, there's been some really interesting work done in Jungian psychology, modern Jungian psychology, trying to synthesize modern notions of chaos theory and analytical psychology. And what's fascinating about chaos theory is, like, if you look at something like traffic, a lot of you might be from New York, you can see traffic does not look very harmonious. If you look at things mathematically, there's what they call emergent order. And in very chaotic processes, there is an order that is beyond we can't grok it linear, because we think linearly, but it's non-linear, but harmonious. And that is a very interesting psychological proposition, that maybe these different directions, viewed from a critical distance, that it's perhaps not, it's difficult to grok from an egoic perspective. Perhaps there is a kind of harmony and order there. And I think that's a really interesting idea. So I think we can kind of hold that tension between what seems like being ripped in many different directions chaotically, and also a kind of a vision of harmony.
If I could quickly respond, I think your question, again, it's a provocative one with regarding to how does the ego adapt when it goes from one context to another. And I think Skip and Brian kind of initially respond to it by saying you need to practice creativity. What do I mean by that? It doesn't have to be something exceptional. It could be something quite ordinary, like switching from one occupation to another. I think one needs to have a practice, an approach of being psychic flexibility or psychic elasticity in order to facilitate. If one practice elasticity, I think it's important. I mean, one does not have to go from Brooklyn to Bangkok to experiences. You could experience a divorce. You're so addicted to being a husband to a spouse. Now what are you? Or to a parent and your children leave. Now what are you? Or you're a general in the military and then they fire you. What are you now? So how does one adapt to new personas? I think it's a fabulous question, and I would submit to you that don't become addicted to them. Execute them, perform them as much as you can. Maximize your performance, but also practice alternative ingredients, psychic gradients. So be creative, play the guitar, learn a different language, fantasize about your next life. I think once you do that, you kind of you're practicing the eminence of change. So when change does come, you have the flexibility, the psychic flexibility. I hope that's a response.
Yeah, and I would add
I like what you said there, George. I think I can relate to that because I'm an artist myself. So that's kind of like the process. I feel like it's a healthy process.
Yeah,
I was a teenager. I used to play rhythm guitar, and then they told me that I wasn't that good. So they told me how to do the bass. I had a hard time. I had to learn the bass. I had to learn a different persona. And silly example, but
I just want to take away the idea that there's a string puller. Okay, there's no puppeteer, and I know Jordan Peterson likes to talk about that, but that's pretty superficial. And the question is, what is your life meant to be? You're going to discover that as you go through it, and you're going to discover it in pretty gross ways. You're going to lose a spouse, or you're going to break your leg, or whatever it is. And so your psyche wants you to do, your unconscious wants you to do certain thing, but then as the Mother Superior said in The Sound of Music to Maria, when God closes a door, he opens a window. And in the end, that's the way it works. Okay. In other words, you see another path forward, whatever it is, and you don't know what it is. I mean, it so happens I'm an artillery officer. So artillery, you can't see the target. You put a round out in the world, and then the forward observer adjusts for where it should land next. And so in your life, it's like that. You don't know what the target is. You don't know what God meant you to be, if you talk in terms of God, and you have to find out. And so something will stop you from doing something, whatever it is, and a window will open that says, okay, I better go try to do this. And that may fail, and you go try to do that. It just so happens that I started fiddling around with Jungian psychology in 1987, and my psyche keeps telling me to come back to it. That's very simply.
Thank you. Next question is from Duncan. Duncan, go ahead.
Hello. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi. So I'm interested in how the persona works in relationships. So my question is, how is an authentic connection and a relationship built while navigating the persona?
Wow, awesome question. I think we could answer it in a number of ways. I'll just talk about what kind of comes to mind. I think one way a persona can limit or has limited me in relationships is if there's some kind of role or identity that I'm playing socially, and a partner or someone I'm in relationship with, makes an offer to connect. And because of my own, what I'm limiting, like maybe I don't want to go ice skating because I'll fall, and I want to be a guy who doesn't fall, and I'm scared of kind of being weak. And maybe this person wanted that to just make a connection that, that involved that. And so kind of limiting, I think being open to just bids for connection, and not letting our persona, our need to be important or whatever narratives we're telling about ourselves, not letting that get in the way of opportunities to connect. And that's the first thing that came to mind, Duncan. I think it's a great question, though.
I think it's also very important to understand what you think you are in this relationship and what your partner thinks you are in this relationship. And are they the same thing? And what's your partner's expectation about what that means for the relationship? I can speak about my own first marriage, which was, largely successful. I had 3 beautiful daughters who are still talking to me, and my first wife is still talking to me. And I still love her like a sister, but we don't educate young people well enough about what's going to happen to them in their psyche. And my problem was I had built this global business, and my wife expected me to come back from Tokyo and set up as a small town lawyer in a town that had 5,000 people in it. And that just wasn't what I was going to do in my life. And she kept trying to whip me into that role of the small town lawyer, and I just wasn't going to do it. And we argued too much, and finally my my second daughter sent a note down in a spiral staircase saying, "Please stop fighting." And I read that note, and I knew at that moment that it couldn't be stopped, because we kept replaying the same record. And that's when I decided to leave lovingly. And so I did that, and I stayed in a relationship with all of them, and so far so good.
Early on, I think Brian we mentioned this book by Hopke, and in the beginning he talks about, and I think this is the question of typology. Again, all these stuffs are inextricable. I think the question of typology comes in, particularly the question of orientation. I think persona is facilitated through extroversion, and then when one is grappling with transpersonal material, it's facilitated through introversion. So I think when you talk about intimate relationship between spouse, for example, I think you need to also, in that conversation, you need to include typology, particularly with regards to orientation and how those energies are being constellated. So I that's my addition to what has been said.
Okay, folks. This has been the most amazing conversation.